Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. John Petrocelli. He is professor of psychology at Wake Forest University. He is a social psychologist, and his research involves experimental social cognition and judgment and decision making. And today we're going to focus on his latest book, The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit. So, Dr. Petrocelli, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me, Ricardo. Thank you.
So, first of all, how do you define bullshit from a psychological perspective?
Well, yeah, I use in my research and in my writing, I've used Harry Frankfurt's original definition of bullshit, which I've expanded on just a bit. But basically, bullshitting is communicating with little to no regard for truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge. And so this would include a broad set of rhetorical strategies designed to either exaggerate one's competence or skills or knowledge in a particular domain, or to impress other people, or to simply talk about things of which one knows little to nothing about, and to pull that off by hiding with flowery language or impressive vocabulary. There's all sorts of ways in which people talk about things in which they know very little about, and so that's the basic definition of bullshitting, but it is often confused for lying. So a lot of times people will say, "Oh, Ricardo's bullshitting," and what they mean is that you're lying. But there's an important distinction between the two behaviors. So whereas the bullshitter doesn't care, isn't paying any attention to truth, established knowledge, or evidence, the liar actually is concerned with those things, because the liar's goal is to distort the truth in some way. So it's helpful to know what the truth is if you're lying. Oftentimes the liar also does not believe what it is that they're communicating, right? So they're intentionally distorting some aspect of the truth. Again, the bullshitter doesn't care, doesn't know, and in some cases, just by accident or just by chance, the bullshitter says something that's actually true. But by definition, the bullshitter wouldn't even know if what they're saying is true, because they're not paying any attention to the truth value of what it is that they're saying. So that's the basic definition and the important difference between the two social behaviors that I work on in my research and writing.
Mm-hmm. But is the bullshitter consciously aware of what he's doing, or is there some sort of also self-deception going around there?
Yeah, there's no reason to believe that it can't be unconscious or entirely conscious. I think you have both cases where people aren't aware at all about what they're doing and are oftentimes quite surprised when they're actually confronted, which is very rare. People who are bullshitting are very rarely confronted, as are liars. I mean, in some parts, calling someone a liar is fighting words, right? In some parts, calling someone a bullshitter is also fighting words. So I think it's entirely possible that one is completely unaware of what they're doing. And it's such an easy behavior. It doesn't take much effort to bullshit. It takes a lot of effort to do the opposite. It takes a lot of work and time and effort to communicate something that is based on evidence. And evidence-based reasoning, or even just checking in and just saying, look, I'm not sure about the evidence, but here's my opinion, to give sort of qualifiers or to show interest, that I am interested in the truth and established knowledge, but I haven't done the fact checking yet. So you'll rarely hear that from communicators as well, but at least they are interested in the truth. So even being aware of it is helpful, but it still entails you to do the work that people are oftentimes unwilling to do. So whether they're aware of it or unaware of it, I think you can. I think it's possible, obviously, to communicate things without a concern for truth, consciously and unconsciously. I think we get a lot of both. I think there's enough bullshit to go around that is based in conscious and unconscious processing.
But do we know what are the motivations behind bullshitting?
So there's two motivations that my research has uncovered. I've argued that there's got to be at least 3 dozen. So first off, the obligation to provide an opinion or to have an opinion seems to be very prevalent in our society. So there are not only issues in which people have traditionally felt that they have to have an opinion about, but I think with the post-internet and post-social media and the amount of sharing of ideas that's going on, people feel as though they have to have not only opinions about big issues like capital punishment and nuclear energy and abortion rights and who should vote and when. It's also about, well, whether or not Slumdog Millionaire should have actually won an Academy Award, and whether or not Kim Kardashian should or shouldn't be able to digitally modify her pictures, and whether or not people should or shouldn't be permitted to carry small dogs in their purses. So it's a wide range of things that people have opinions about and can readily generate opinions, even if they're completely unaware of the topic. So the obligation to provide an opinion is very strong, and it's near impossible to have a well-informed opinion about everything, right? But that doesn't seem to stop people. I've run several studies now where I've created fictitious products or fictitious diseases. This well before COVID as well. I mean, fictitious drugs, and people can tell you, well, this is how you prevent this disease and the likelihood of contracting it, and it's completely fictitious. They're not told that it's fictitious, but they think it's real, and especially if you give people easy to imagine symptoms and easy to imagine ways of treating it, that they just really go to town in describing the disease that doesn't even exist. So that's the first thing, the obligation to provide an opinion, and then also the ease with which people expect to get away with it. So if I make it extremely easy for you to get away with bullshitting me, so for instance, I'm not a expert by any stretch of the imagination when it comes to automobiles. So if you tell me that an engine works in this way, I'm likely to believe you, right? Especially if you're an auto mechanic and you have more expertise than I do. So that's going to be rather easy. If we're both bullshitting, and the social situation suggests that bullshitting is acceptable in this conversation, that tends to cue people to bullshit even more, right? So the ease in which we believe that we can get away with communication, that's a major motivation, because now we have just made the communication easier. If we signal that there's no bullshit allowed in this conversation, and we're saying we only want evidence-based reasoning in communication, well, that's much more difficult. And it's going to take much more effort, right? So those are two major motivations. But there's a study that's actually not even in press right now that was done with over 400 employees in corporate settings, And they had defined for them what bullshit was using Harry Frankfurt's original definition. And they said, well, why would you do this behavior? And when is the last time that you engaged in bullshitting? What was the situation? And was it successful? And they came up with 36 unique situations, contexts in which people use bullshit. And the two major dimensions of that was when they categorized all 36 unique situations was the promotion of status. So you can promote your status by sounding impressive and making yourself sound like you have more knowledge than you actually have, or more skills. But you could also bullshit to get out of responsibilities, to get out of blame and condemnation. So there's sort of two ways to promote status, is to actively move in the direction of this idea that I've got more skills than I actually have, or to suggest, well, anything going on in our company right now that isn't going well, it's not my fault, right? So that was one dimension. And then the other dimension was communion or connection with others. So people will try to connect with others and comment on things that they don't know anything about. They might comment on sports or something in someone's office, or some kind of connection to draw further favor from another individual. But then there are other people in which we're not successful in communicating with. We've never been successful, and we, quite frankly, don't see eye to eye. We might use bullshit to, I don't know, maybe talk about the weather as opposed to what we did over the weekend, just to kind of get around. So it's to get along or to get around this person, or to sort of get out of the conversation. So those are sort of the two dimensions. And you can imagine there's interactions between these things, but I still think that the 36 unique situations just in the workplace suggest to us that in our daily lives, even outside of the workplace, there must be dozens of different motivations or situations in which we find bullshitting quite convenient and, quite frankly, has advantages, at least in the short term. Now, I've argued that bullshitting in the long term can have negative consequences, kind of ranging from annoying to quite dangerous. So I think in the long run, bullshit has more negative consequences than benefits that it might have in the short term.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that an idea like everyone's entitled to their own opinion promotes bullshit?
I think as that stretches, having an opinion doesn't mean that your opinion is true. So to the extent that people associate or align opinion with truth, or to the extent to which they align argument with evidence, I think it does spill over into a form of bullshitting, or does help proliferate the frequency of the behavior. And that is a well accepted sort of proverbial kind of statement. And so, of course, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but yeah, it certainly doesn't mean that opinion is based on evidence, truth, or established knowledge. Some opinions are, but if I tell you, Ricardo, well, I was the greatest athlete back in the day. I was the greatest street hockey player in my neighborhood, and no one could stop me. And I mean, if I just continue to go on, and that's okay. That's my opinion, but it's not based. It's certainly not based in any kind of systematic measurement in which we would generate that opinion or that finding. So, of course, I think it does. I think you're right. I think it does spill over into the bullshitting behavior.
Mm-hmm. At a certain point there, in my previous question, you were saying that there are, I think, certain kinds of social contexts that promote bullshitting. I mean, what are those? I mean, do they have certain kinds of traits? I mean, how does it work? What are the kinds of environments that promote it?
Okay, so the primary environment is actually I would say there's probably more warning signs than guideposts on this one, and it's going to happen in every context. It's happened in every context that I've studied empirically, except one context, and that is a context in which you remove the obligation, and you remove the obligation by stating, you have to state it at least 2 or 3 times, at least in a research lab, to participants that you are not obligated to provide an opinion. You know, you can type an opinion if you want, but you're under no obligation. We even remind them, you say, remember, in the consent form, we told you that you can withdraw at any time. You can skip questions. It's up to you. You're not obligated. Your participation is completely voluntary, and if you quit the study, you still get your research credit. You still get the benefit that we promised to you, because now you're participating. So you have to say that at least 2 or 3 times, and remove the obligation. But you also have to add to it that bullshitting or cue, you have to cue to the individual that bullshitting is not acceptable. And the easiest way to do that is to have them generate expectations of an audience that actually knows more than they do. So if I tell a student, well, I'm interested in your opinion about nuclear energy, but before you write your opinion, I remind you you're not obligated to provide an opinion. And also, if you write an opinion, what we're going to ask you to do is justify your opinions to a sociology professor that we have in the next room, who happens to have written a book and is an expert on nuclear energy, something to that effect. So that cues to the individual that, okay, I'm probably not going to get away with bullshitting. For the same reason, I'm not going to bullshit an auto mechanic, because I'm going to sound like a complete idiot, right? And they're going to know that I don't know what I'm talking about right away, and then I'm just setting myself up for being taken advantage of, right? Because now my bill maybe just went from $100 to $1,000. So if you cross both of those and you sort of remove the obligation and you suggest, well, getting away with bullshit will be rather difficult, that's the only situation that I found that people do not bullshit. So in all other contexts, because it's so easy, it's almost like breathing. It's difficult not to do. And behavior tends to flow in the direction of ease, right? So it's easier to categorize the situations in which it doesn't occur, because in all other situations, other than one in which you're not obligated and one in which it's going to be difficult to get away with anyway, most research participants admit to about 40% of the total content that they provide is bullshit. So what we usually do is we ask them. So our best empirical way of measuring bullshitting is to ask them, so Ricardo, when you wrote that thought, to what extent were you truly concerned with genuine evidence, established knowledge, and truth? And usually what we get is a score from a 0 to 10, what we get is a 6. So they're saying, I'm about 60% concerned with that, right? So that translates to a 40% score of bullshit score, because bullshitting is the lack thereof of concern for truth. So I actually think that the bullshitting scores are actually probably should be about 60 to 70% after reading what it is that research participants tend to write. but what they usually report is about 40%, and that's quite a bit. I mean, that's more than a third of the content that they're generating. That in so many words, they are admitting that they are providing content that is beyond their actual knowledge of the content area. And to me, that's not only fascinating, but it's quite disturbing, because you can get this again with just about any topic. I've asked my research participants, what about a child who's failing a course in school, or why do prisoners, once they're released from prison, often return to crime? And these are kind of social issues that people have interest in, and if you just show a little bit of interest in a person's opinion and they really don't know what they're talking about, that doesn't stop them. They can generate all kinds of content. I have treasure troves of written content that in my estimation, I believe is still about 60 or 70% of it could be classified as bullshit. But we usually ask the individual, because only the individual knows what their true motivations are. Social perceivers do have an opinion as well. What's remarkable, however, is that social perceivers, on average, tend to agree with the individual who rates themselves. So I had always expected, well, social perceivers would know, they would be able to detect more bullshit than the individual is willing to report. But that's not actually true. They're usually they're about even if you look at the average social perceivers ratings of the same content that the bullshitter generates themselves.
So is bullshitting always a bad thing? Does it always have bad consequences, or is it always costly for someone?
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important question. I don't believe that it's always negative. I think there are times where I think bullshit is maybe merely annoying, and like, again, if I tell you that I was the greatest street hockey player of all time, that might, people might roll their eyes, but I think that's rather harmless. To the extent that I'm not drafted by the Montreal Canadiens to be their starting center. But I think there are cases as well where there might be some benefit. So I remember growing up, my mother would tell me, John, they put a certain chemical element into that swimming pool water, so as to reveal the presence of urine, to prevent people from peeing in the pool, right? And as every child knows, that's not actually true. But I think there is some, there's certainly cases where the adults also know that that's not true, and so they're lying, right? But there's, I think, many more cases where it's gone untested, and they assume that it's true, and they've really never tested the theory, and so in that case, we would categorize it as bullshitting. But I think to the extent that it prevents children from urinating in the pool, I think there's maybe some benefit. But I do think there are many more cases in which it's at least bad. We had our former president during his campaigning, he suggested that no one would vote for a face like that. He said, look at that face. Would anyone vote for a face like that? And to me, that's not only bad, but the consequences are clear. That it's certainly demeaning and devaluing of women. It suggests that women can't be effective leaders unless they're attractive. I mean, that's just senseless. And I think it certainly has some harm. But I think there are cases of bullshit that get even much worse. So we have a large problem of people texting while driving or distracted while driving, and you'll hear a lot of people say, you know what, everybody does it. Everybody does it, and my driving isn't affected while I'm, texting, my mother. So that's just my reaction to that usually is no, no, no. That not only is there very good evidence that your driving is affected negatively. It's just it's dangerous to the extent that not only you believe that, but that other people hear you say something like that and then adopt the belief themselves. And there's nothing more important to decision making than what you believe to be true. Okay, and to the extent that bullshit shapes what you believe to be true, you're indirectly affecting decision making. And decision making that's based on bullshit is clearly suboptimal. There's much better information out there that is useful to decision making than bullshit. And again, some bullshit may be correct, but the chances of that I'm not willing to take.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if there are any individual differences in how prone people are to bullshitting?
Yeah, so there are some work, early work, primarily done by Gordon Pennycook, that looked at that very question, and the cognitive style that people tend to have. If you think about that as an individual difference variable or a personality variable, there seems to be some evidence that analytic or reflective cognitive styles in which you're willing to analyze and search for information, as opposed to the intuitive sort of gut reaction thinking style, is quite helpful in detecting at least pseudo profound bullshit. So the favor again is in the direction of analytic reflective thinking over that of intuitive. But we only know that insofar as statements like hidden meaning transforms unparalleled abstract beauty. Okay, so that's a pseudo profound bullshit statement. It has no meaning. It was actually put together by a computer algorithm that just spits out syntactically and semantically correct sentences, but there's no intention to communicate truth or genuine evidence, established knowledge with that statement. And people who have an analytic, reflective thinking style tend to catch on to that more so than intuitive. But the effect is rather small. I think it's actually barely noticeable. So I actually have work right now that I'm conducting to see whether or not that cognitive style, the willingness to kind of fight against the intuitive pull that a lot of those statements have. So the intuitive pull that we know it's very difficult to catch on to that we can measure with the cognitive reflection test. The famous item of a bat and ball cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? The intuitive pull on that question is 10 cents, right? But that's wrong, right? So we know that people who say 10 cents, they're less likely to catch on, and they're more likely to say, "Oh, hidden meaning transforms unparalleled abstract beauty." That's actually that's very profound. But the people who say, "Well, the ball must cost 5 cents," they're more likely to have the cognitive style of an analytic, reflective thinker, and they're more likely to say, "I'm not so sure that hidden meaning transforms unparalleled abstract beauty is profound." But in daily life, that pseudo-profound bullshit is not the form in which we're most likely to be exposed to, unless we're Deepak Chopra fans, and we're exposed. We communicate with him every day. It's more of the kind of sort of proverbial beliefs of opposites attract versus birds of a feather flock together. Now, both of those can be correct under certain conditions. Although birds of a feather flock together usually gets more, we usually find in the research that's more correct than opposites attract, at least when it comes to romantic relationships, close relationships, and friendships. But I'm also more interested in the types of bullshit that people might hear, such as cats make you live longer, or people who own cats live longer than people who don't, or storing batteries in your freezer will increase the efficiency of those batteries by 50%, or that you can see the Great Wall of China from outer space. Those types of bullshit claims. All of those are false, by the way. If I'm able to detect and differentiate false claims, bullshit claims against things that sound a little fishy, that I'm a little skeptical about, but are true, to me, is the real bullshit detector. And whether or not someone is actually willing and able to collect readily available data to inform that decision, their willingness to do that, and their willingness to ask in pride, ask additional questions. We don't know now whether or not that correlates with the reflective, analytic thinking style, but we're taking a look at that. I don't see why it wouldn't, but I do think just the behavior, the willingness to find additional information to inform the judgment or the decision, I think it's still up in the air. It amazes me, though, Ricardo, that we don't know the answer to that. When I started the research about 8 years ago on bullshitting behavior, I was quite dismayed that there was nothing other than Harry Frankfurt's seminal paper on the topic and a number of philosophical papers, and there were also papers in business, even law, that talked about the behavior, but there was no empirical findings kind of informing what we do and what we don't know about the field. So it's quite wide open. We don't know much about this behavior, which I can't think of a more pervasive behavior than bullshitting. In terms of social behavior, again, it's quite surprising that we're just now scratching the surface of our empirical understanding of this behavior.
What about being susceptible to believing bullshit? Are there differences there? I mean, are some people more susceptible to it than others, or are we all more or less equally susceptible to it?
Yeah, I believe that there is variation. Overall, there's probably less variation than there is in particular domains. So certainly in particular domains, if I'm an expert in a particular domain, that's one domain that it's going to be very difficult to bullshit me, and I'm going to have the knowledge and the expertise to detect it. But then you get me outside of another domain. So if we want to talk social psychology, I'm pretty solid in that area. But again, if you switch to automobiles, I'm really on shaky ground. But I'm probably less likely to be bullshitted because I'm aware of it. So I would think general knowledge in a particular domain, and your awareness that you don't know what you need to know to be competent. That's got to be the two most important factors. We know from at least 20 years now that, the Dunning-Kruger effect that so many people are talking about, this idea that the cognitive skills, the mental skills that you need to be competent in a domain are often the very same mental skills that we need to recognize competence in a domain. So oftentimes you have people who are completely unaware of their incompetence, and they tend to rate themselves well above average in a domain. So once you have the awareness, I think you're in a better position. Once you have the awareness that, okay, I'm not competent in this area, then I think you're in a better position to ask the questions that you desperately need to ask in order to diagnose, and detect bullshit. But the problem is that the people who are often most confident in their ability to detect bullshit are often the least likely to significantly detect it. So there's work being done, I know, on this very question by Shane Luttrell, who's asked not only the likelihood of detecting bullshit, but your likelihood of producing it. So the likelihood of producing it is actually correlated negatively with your ability to detect it. So there's a bit of a silver lining there that because some people believe that you can't bullshit a bullshitter, but his research shows that you actually can, to the extent that they can detect pseudo profound bullshit. We don't know about the more common, like everyday form of bullshit that people are actually frequently exposed to. But I think certainly awareness varies across domains, and knowledge varies across domains, and those would be the most important factors, I think, in one's susceptibility. If you're aware of your relative incompetence, then I think that places you in the best position to kind of pry a little bit further and ask the important questions, the basic critical thinking questions, basic critical thinking 101 skills that will help you detect bullshit, because that's the number one method of detecting bullshit is asking the important questions, important follow-up questions. And if you can't ask the bullshitter themselves, because we're not always in direct communication with bullshitters, we can ask ourselves those questions and pry a little bit further. But that's another factor that differs and varies across individuals, is just their basic willingness to do that.
Mm-hmm. And how do we determine that something is bullshit? I mean, is there any set of principles or criteria that we can apply to really say, okay, so this thing that this person is saying is in fact bullshit?
Yes. Now, the most straightforward way, but not necessarily the most accurate way, is to simply ask the communicator and say, when you made that statement a minute ago, Ricardo, to what extent were you truly concerned with truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge? I wouldn't recommend saying, were you bullshitting me? But we do, some people do say that, sort of indirectly in communication. They'll say when they're communicating something that sounds bullshit, they might say, no bullshit. They'll say no bullshit. Like I'm not bullshit. I'm not lying. I'm not deceiving you in any way. Sometimes you'll hear the receiver also ask, really? No bullshit. So those are sort of some direct ways. But again, I think it's in some ways similar to asking people if they're lying to you. And 99% of the time, the liar is going to tell you, no, I'm not lying, right? So it would be the most direct way, but it wouldn't necessarily be the most accurate. I think that there's three basic questions that you need in order to diagnose someone's basic concern with truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge that we've found in our research that are most effective, and that is simply what, how, and have you considered? So if you ask the potential bullshitter, you ask, well, Ricardo, what what exactly are you saying? I hear you saying that, okay, well, if we tear down the wall and let anyone into the country, that it's going to have all kinds of negative consequences for our future. Is that what you're saying? So you have to kind of, maybe paraphrase and reframe back to the communicator. What exactly is the claim? Oftentimes, if it's bullshit, it may be the first time the communicator has heard their own words and listens to what they're actually saying. And they'll often take a couple of backpedaled steps and start to clean it up right away. They'll say, well, no, that's not exactly what I'm saying is, X, Y, and Z. So you're already doing yourself a favor by reducing some of the bullshit exposure by just asking the clarification what question. What exactly are you saying? And we know that clarification is a major antidote to bullshit. So the next question, though, would be, well, how do you know? So I hear you saying, let's tear down the wall. How do you know that it's going to have the consequences that you say it's going to have? Now, that particular question should be effective. It doesn't always work that way. It doesn't always work the way we want it to. It should promote some disconfirmatory evidence. It should promote the communicator to look at the full array of data kind of speaking to the issue, right? So the favorite how do you know question only works part of the time. If you can move also to how would you know that this claim is wrong, or how would you know that the claim is false, then you can get the bullshitters to at least entertain some possibilities in how it might be wrong. They may have never considered that. The tendency that we know from treasure troves of confirmation bias research is that it's one of the strongest, it's one of the strongest biases that we know of. The tendency to search for, attend to, and only care about that evidence which confirms our opinions and our hypotheses and our beliefs, and disregard all other disconfirmatory evidence and completely dismiss it is the confirmation bias, and it's very, very strong. So if you can get to the what and how do you know, or how might the claim be wrong, and if you move to, well, I hear you're claiming, claim A. Have you considered B? Do you see the conflict between A and B? Have you reconciled those differences? Have you reconciled that conflict? Have you thought about that? And sometimes the bullshitter has thought about it. Most often they haven't. Once you get answers to those three questions, I think you're in a very good position to diagnose the communicator's true intentions and their real interest in truth, genuine evidence, and established knowledge. And then you can make for yourself a well-informed decision as to whether or not you are buying what it is that they're selling. So I think those three basic questions are extremely helpful. They're rarely asked because when we think that someone is bullshitting, we just say, "Oh, Ricardo's bullshitting. It's harmless. It's harmless, and it doesn't have an effect on me." And that's where we can't be more wrong. It's best to diagnose, well, what kind of information is this, and is it true, or to what extent may it be true, or under what conditions might it be true? We're in a better position moving forward to make a decision or a judgment based on that information.
Mm-hmm. So another question about that. Do people generally care if someone is bullshitting or not, or does it depend on the issue at hand? I mean, if it's important or not for the person?
I've argued that we don't tend to care as much as we should. So again, the biggest problem with, I think, being the recipient of bullshit is that most people think that one, they're excellent at detecting it, despite all of the research that shows that they're not, right? And two, that they're not negatively affected by it. So one, I'm great at detecting it, and that's why it's harmless, or that the general content itself is harmless. But research that I've been conducting on the memory effect that we call the illusory truth effect, when you mix in false statements, such as Sydney is the capital of Australia, or that styrofoam was invented in Norway, things like that. So those are false statements. When you mix those kinds of statements in with a bunch of other true statements, and then within the hour give individuals new statements along with some of the old statements that they heard earlier, they can easily confuse the familiarity with the statements they heard earlier with truth. So, and it's very easy. It's a very easy paradigm to run. You ask people how interesting are these statements in the first phase, so that they could be exposed to styrofoam was invented in Norway, and then later on you ask them, is it true or false, right? And when they hear, oh, styrofoam was invented in Norway, then oh, it feels familiar, it must be true. So it only takes one prior exposure of a false statement or a bullshit statement to associate it with truth. Okay, so to the extent that bullshit is shaping our beliefs, then and then transfers into judgments and decisions, we're really in a bad position. But it doesn't take more than one exposure. I used to think that it would take, oh yes, maybe it would take like 40 exposures, this repeated exposure effect that we have known about for at least 3 decades now. Most of the paradigms only show like maybe 1 or 2 exposure. It is true that if you expose people to the same idea multiple times, we've shown that in the lab as well, that the illusory truth effect gets even stronger. But to demonstrate, from baseline to a significant difference only takes 1 exposure. So I see that as another fascinating but disturbing reality about bullshit.
Mm-hmm. If we don't ask the bullshitter any questions, are there any clear signs that someone is bullshitting that we can try to pick up on, pay attention to? I don't know, just to give an example, is there something in the verbal expressions they use, how they speak or something like that are clear signs of bullshitting?
Yes, and now all of these signs, there are definitely signs. I want to make clear though that not all of these signs are ipso facto evidence of bullshitting, because they're the same words that everyone else is using. But if you're seeing multiple signs, then I think our bullshit detector red flags can go up. So I had mentioned earlier the use of pseudo profundity, right? So if we hear all kinds of business speak is notorious for using pseudo profundity, but it sounds harmless, and everybody uses the terms. And again, it doesn't mean that if I use the word leverage or bandwidth or win-win that I'm bullshitting, right? But there are signals of pseudo profundity in that atmosphere. You also have cases where people make claims that don't even pass a simple plausibility test. So in exaggerating, I once heard a stockbroker suggest that or claim that a stock had decreased by 300%. And I thought that can't, there must be a typo here or something, right? But if something decreases by even 100%, it's zero, right? It can't decrease by 300%. It can increase by 300%, but that doesn't even pass a basic plausibility test. Certainly, the use of stories, the use of anecdotes, uniformly and exclusively to form arguments, is a well-known tactic of the bullshit artist, if you will, and that is to use only stories that support the claim. So we'll hear people who justify smoking behavior. They may tell us that, well, my Uncle Larry smoked 2 packs a day and he lived till he was 89, which is okay. Some people do smoke 2 packs a day and they live to 89, but they're few and far between, right? But the exclusive use of anecdotal stories, the strong tendency to completely ignore any disconfirming evidence is another tactic used, and it's hard to hear. I mean, it's not so much a language indicator, but it's more of of the technique that is used. There's obviously cases where people inflate their own credibility. They use name dropping to sort of paint this picture that they're more competent than they actually are in a particular area. They use what I've called unsubstantiated character building in assassination. So sometimes when we have opposition is apparent, people will just tear down the character. They'll tell you all kinds of negative things to maybe disqualify and silence that voice. But anyone who agrees with their perspective, we want to paint this picture that, oh, those are the real experts, right? And then there's also a tendency to appeal to personal relationships. And the reason for that is that it's very, very difficult to call bullshit on a friend, not only because of our interpretation of close others and their communication, which we tend to make excuses for our friends, right? Or the people that we like and we feel that they're competent in what it is that they're communicating. We make excuses for them even when they are clearly bullshitting, right? So, and it's very difficult to confront a friend or colleague on their bullshit, right, directly. So those are some of the things. But bullshitters also tend to use more words. They're very wordy. They tend to talk fast, and they don't permit us to ask questions because they're talking so fast and they're moving on, right? So those can be effective. They oftentimes take the focus. Interestingly, they take the focus off of themselves. So they use other-oriented pronouns like they and he and she, as opposed to self-directed, self-oriented pronouns like me and I and myself. But again, there's not the strongest evidence for detecting these cues has more to do with the techniques used as opposed to like any particular word. It's very difficult. I mean, there's some evidence that we know that when people are not interested in truth, that they use some linguistic elements more or less than others. So if you expose people to a set of instructions that tells you, well, Ricardo, in this case, I want you to lie, versus, in another case, I want you to tell the truth. There is a way to detect that with even just verb usage and use of negative versus positive words. But in daily life, it's very difficult to detect these things unless you've got a computer, running in your, unless you're doing content analysis. And maybe someday we will have that technology where we can do content analysis and get signals from it, as in the moment, in real time. But But the only way that I know how to do it is to run it through a software program and analyze, which usually takes me a couple of hours. So until we can speed that up, it's the bullshit detectors are still going to be rather elementary.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because some of the tactics that you mentioned that are employed by bullshit artists in this case seem very similar to the ones used by pseudoscientists and science deniers. Is that right? And I mean, in that case, is also pseudoscience and science denial a form of bullshit?
Oh, I believe so, absolutely. Because we have very good science today. I mean, the science. I mean, we're so advanced today in what we know and what we don't know, and there's still a lot. I believe there's a lot that we clearly do not know.
Sure.
But I would say the very best reason to believe anything is the cases whereby we have multiple independent lines of inquiry, especially multiple independent lines of inquiry coming from people in areas that don't traditionally communicate, that maybe even in opposition or just completely divorced from each other, which we even have in psychology. We have subfields in psychology that clearly do not communicate very well together. And so if you have a case where you say, all right, the world, the shape of the earth is round, and you have multiple independent lines of inquiry all coming to that very same conclusion, that's a pretty good indicator that on something like the world is round. I mean, if the astrophysicists are telling us this, and the mathematicians are telling us that, and physicists are telling us that, and even psychologists are telling us, yes, the earth is round. I mean, that's a pretty good indicator. I think Edward Wilson referred to that as a consilience of inductions, but it's really just a convergence of evidence. And somebody who is a pseudoscientist or an astrologist or someone who claims to speak with the dead, and does our cold, warm, and hot readings and things. They're not in touch with real science. And yes, certainly pseudoscience. I think it is to the extent that they know to the extent that they believe it to be true, as opposed to they know that they're not actually speaking with the dead and they're lying, because maybe there are some liars that do this work, but to the extent that they actually believe it and disregard all other science and inquiry, I think it's a clear signal that they're not interested in truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge. So I would categorize those as a certain type of maybe somewhat more sophisticated and possibly leading to a monetary gain form of bullshit, but bullshit nonetheless.
Do you care about trying to understand bullshitting from an evolutionary perspective? I mean, does it matter to you if there's an evolutionary rationale behind this behavior?
Well, that's one area that I would say that I'm certainly not an expert in evolutionary psychology.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to give you an example of what it is that I'm ultimately trying to reduce. So I think, I can certainly speculate on it, but I mean, I have no reason to believe that that bullshitting, like any other form of communication, is any more special or unique than either lying or telling the truth. But I think if it's an easy form of communication and it's effective, that's really all you need. And if that's being reinforced, throughout the centuries, and I think that it's evolved just like any other form of communication. Now, if I'm right in suggesting that it's a pervasive yet insidious behavior, well, we have all kinds of things that we do that have negative consequences. And again, I think that maybe in the short term, it has some positive outcomes, especially for the individual, but the long-term negative consequences are there certainly for society writ large. So, but we have all kinds of behaviors. I think the focus that I had in my research well before bullshitting on counterfactual thinking, this would have, could have, should have, if only types of thoughts. All of my research pointed in the direction that impaired memory to some degree and impaired decision making. But counterfactual thinking is quite automatic, and so there's another thought, a very easy thought process that occurs when you almost get what you want and you didn't. It's near impossible not to generate the counterfactual that, if you've played the pick 3 lottery tonight and the number was 258 and you had played 259, you're not going to say, oh well, I lost. No, you're going to generate lots of counterfactuals. Well, I could have played 258 and it's only one number away. It's impossible not to, but it's not going to help you long term, and especially to the extent that it increases your gambling behavior. It's even more dysfunctional. So I do think of bullshitting behavior and bullshit reasoning as a dysfunctional behavior. So I'm not sure exactly why evolutionary forces have led us there, but it wouldn't be the first time, and it certainly won't be the last. So so that's my answer to that question. I don't know if
No,
that's what we're looking for, but yeah. But again, I mean that's all speculation. It's not anything based in hardcore boots on the ground evidence that I've got. So.
Yeah. So this is another thing that you touch on in the book. Are TED Talks problematic?
Yeah, I think they're extremely problematic, Ricardo. I've been a long time critic of TED Talks, and for a very long time, I had said that I would never do a TED Talk. But in fact, I did do a TED Talk on the very subject of bullshitting and the dangers of it and the problems with it. But I think to the extent that many TED Talk and TEDx speakers appear to be experts in their field, and usually they do. I mean, certainly there are dozens of excellent TED Talks, and they're very informative and very educational, absolutely. But the large majority of them, and I have no systematic data on this, but I've watched at least 1,000 TED Talks, and the large majority of them, especially the ones that are sort of motivational, kind of calls to action about, you can be the best person in the world, you can be the best at anything, and this very cliche message, as if we had not heard it thousands of times before, can be packaged in so many different ways, whether it be success in business or success in losing weight through dieting or some other health. I mean, there's just so much, there's so many more ideas out there than are ideas that are empirically grounded and based in evidence. And I think to the extent that those are confused for actual evidence, And to the extent that we might rely on what appears to be an expert, they can be, I believe they can be damaging. And so I think it really kind of goes back to taking a look at, well, what are the claims? How does, who is telling me this? How do they know it? And what are they trying to sell me? That's another three set question that is basic critical thinking, skills 101. But most TED Talks, I think, at least the ones that get the millions of views, they tend to be these kind of inspirational, motivational. Everything's going to be much easier than you ever thought it would be. To me, my bullshit detection flags go right up right away, because life is not easy. Success is not easy. There's going to be lots of people who have luck, or have been in the right place at the right time, or have met the right people, and they are successful. But they're oftentimes the first people who are ready to tell us their 5-step program to to success and high performing teams or something like that. And it's just like, all right, well, when you look at the actual evidence for or against these types of these claims, that it doesn't always pan out very well. And so I think the large majority of these TED Talks can be more damaging than helpful, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Can we prevent bullshit from spreading?
Well, I've argued that to the extent that we become more comfortable in confronting bullshitters and calling them on their bullshit, we can do that. At this current time, I don't believe that calling bullshit is the norm. It's certainly not a descriptive norm, and it's not quite the injunctive norm. So descriptive norms are beliefs about what most people do in most cases, right? It's our opinions about what everyone is doing. But injunctive norms refer to what we think we should do in a particular situation. And lots of times, in talking with people about what I do, they seem to agree that, yeah, maybe calling bullshit is something that we should do more often. But we don't really have the kind of the social sort of rules and social kind of procedures to do it. So that's why I've offered sort of maybe a quick rule book for how to do it. So I borrowed primarily from Carl Bergstrom's 5 rules. I've added a 6th rule, but it's very simple, and when you consider it, you don't even have to use the word bullshit, because the one of the rules is to be considerate and to consider the possibility that you might be the one who's confused. And when you act, even if you can act a bit confused, that will often prompt bullshitters to clarify their claims. And again, when bullshitters are clarifying their claims, they tend to clean it up, and it's a great antidote to reducing. It's a great antidote to bullshit. But that's actually rule 2. Rule 1 is to call bullshit when you're sure that it's bullshit. So it's not helpful to call bullshit in a lot of cases, because that can be a real conversation killer, right? So I wouldn't even use the word bullshit, but I would be certain before you confront someone and call them on their bullshit that it certainly is bullshit. And then the third rule is to attack the claim. Focus just on the claim, but don't attack the person. And that's also kind of part of being considerate. And rule 4 is to permit the bullshitter to restate the claim or to change the claim. Okay, so to not hold them so strongly to what they may have said before, because we know, like, once people publicize a belief, it's very difficult for them to go back because they're in a sense at least suggesting that something was wrong, right? Or they might have to say that they were sorry, right? Two very rare behaviors, right? So we permit them to do it because it's a much easier pill to swallow, right? The reasonable error in one's judgment or the reasonable error in thinking is an easier pill to swallow than they're just bullshitting and they're not worth listening to, right? So the fifth rule that's helpful is that when you recognize your own bullshit, that you just admit it. That because doubling down on your own bullshit it's not helpful. It makes things worse. So if you're willing to do that and you're willing to show, that kind of rules into rule number 4 a little bit by saying, because you can always say, Ricardo, I used to think that too. I used to think I was the greatest street hockey player of all time too, but now I know better now, right? So if you can demonstrate some humility, I think it's helpful in sort of admitting even your own bullshit or previous bullshit. But the important 6th rule, I think, is to not address bullshit with more bullshit. You've got to be ready, and you've got to have some awareness of readily available data and evidence to combat that bullshit, right? So to the extent you're willing to do that, I think you're in a better position to more competently call bullshit. And it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it doesn't require us to use the word bullshit, right? Because I would recommend not even using that word because you can get people to shut down quite readily if they think that. I would make it more of sort of an interested inquiry. Ricardo, I've never heard that claim before. That's really interesting. I want to know more. If you engage someone and you show that you're interested, you can get much further than just saying, "Oh, I think that's bullshit, and here's why." That's not effective. So I hope that we become more comfortable in confronting others, and because the current norm is to just assume that, oh yes, it doesn't really have any effect, but it most certainly does. And it affects things like our wallets and our career decisions, and people that we decide to befriend and trust and respect. I think it does have a rather large effect, and to the extent that we can be more aware of that, I think we're in a better position to make decisions in life.
Great. So let's end on that note then. The book is, again, The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit. Where can people find your work on the internet?
Well, they certainly find the book in all places that books are sold. But I'm easy to find either on Twitter as John V. Petro. And you can also find me easily through Wake Forest University Psychology, yeah, that's about it. That's my internet presence. Twitter and email.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
All right, it's been fun, Ricardo. Thanks so much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running. I will leave links in the description box to Patreon and PayPal. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Ernst Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnold Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Des Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, My Producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Keon Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Thomas Trumbull, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.